Okay, well, perhaps I can just put it in context. One country, two systems, which was the rubric under which the joint declaration was negotiated, was in many respects a brilliant concept which dealt with real problems on the Chinese side and the British side. On both sides, there were both political and moral embarrassments. On the Chinese side, they were dealing with a territory which had been ripped from them, stolen from them by colonial powers in the 19th century, unequal treaties and all that. Secondly, there was a huge embarrassment for them because more than half the population of Hong Kong were people who were refugees from communism in China, who had swum, who had clambered over razor wire to get away from the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward, to get away from communism, to find a better life in this colonial oppression. So there was an embarrassment for them about that. Secondly, it was embarrassing for us, first of all, because of the history, which I've mentioned. Yes. Secondly, because every other colony, or territory we used to call it, every other territory for which we were responsible for, we would prepare, sometimes under duress, for independence. And we'd put in place we'd parachute copies of Jennings' History of the British Constitution. We would introduce democratic institutions. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't, but countries were becoming independent. And that was never possible. That was never going to be possible in Hong Kong, which was morally difficult for us. The Chinese used to press us back in the 70s and certainly the 70s not to introduce democracy in Hong Kong, because they thought that if we did that, people in Hong Kong would start to think that they were just going to be like Singapore or another Asian country. And Zhou Enlai, I think, sent messages to that effect, as did others, to Harold Macmillan and other political leaders. So it was a difficult backdrop, and in many respects, one country, two systems was a brilliant way proposed by Deng Xiaoping of dealing with this. I think one country, two systems and adherence to the joint declaration worked pretty well for the first 10 or 15 years after we left. It wasn't perfect. They rode back, the Chinese, on commitments they'd made on democratic development, specifically that people in Hong Kong should be able to decide the arrangements themselves. There were one or two interventions, one of which was mentioned by a professor earlier in Hong Kong's affairs. And there were lots of criticisms you could make, but by and large, Hong Kong was still had a great sense of citizenship. It still had a good balance between economic and political freedom. There were no questions about the rule of law, freedom of speech, and so on and so on. It was still probably one of the freest cities in Asia. I think, as Steve Chang, as Professor Chang was saying earlier, that changed pretty decisively with Xi Jinping. I think just as he rode back from Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, with consequences we can now see in relation to state-owned enterprises in the private sector. I think just as he cracked down on dissidents and cracked down in Xinjiang, which you were talking about just now, just as he cracked down on human rights lawyers, and just as the party, having stepped back from controlling everything, the party went back into trying to control every aspect of government or other sorts of life. I think just as that happened in mainland China, so in Hong Kong, the United Front became more active, the Joint Liaison Office became more active, and there was a general tightening of control over all those aspects of Hong Kong's system, which go beyond one country, two systems. This isn't just about capitalism. It's about the rule of law. It's about free speech. It's about all the freedoms we associate with pluralism. And I think that's happened to a considerable extent over the last half a dozen years. So that, for example, at the Geneva Human Rights Commission meetings in I think November this year, 5 or 6 countries specifically raised human rights in Hong Kong, quite separately from human rights in China, which is, I think, the first time it's happened. I think that anybody, toadies, who suggest that useful idiots, to use a Marxist expression, who tell you that nothing's changed in Hong Kong, can't be listening to what anybody in Hong Kong is saying or talking to people. I think it was Steve at the end who pointed out that in the latest poll, 51%, I think it was, of young people in Hong Kong talk about whether they can emigrate. And that's a terrible criticism of what's happened. So I think things, on the whole, went pretty well for a bit. It's extraordinary that it's taken a Chinese government, an autocratic Chinese government in Beijing, to produce an independence movement in Hong Kong. With the colonial oppressor, there was no independence movement. With the colonial oppressor, I think when I was governor, I think the largest anti-government protest we had was a few hundred people. So I think it's worrying what's happened in the last few years, and I don't think it is. I follow something that the chairman said earlier. Whenever you produce criticisms, the Chinese or the Chinese ambassador say, this is anti-Chinese, you're attacking the Chinese people. Nobody's attacking the Chinese people. If we're sane, we all want a prosperous, stable China playing a major role in global affairs. What we're critical of is the behavior of a Chinese communist regime and a Chinese communist dictatorship, which is what it is now. And I don't think it's unreasonable for us to occasionally assert our own values in responding to that.